You can see the phrase in quotation marks in the title, and that is because it is literal. And you'll see what that means as we go along this morning. And given the songs that we just sung, what's the proper grammar with that term, word, I don't know. Imagine these songs. Sing to me of hell when we all get to hell. How beautiful hell must be. Hell holds all to me. You say, I've never heard those songs before. Those are songs that we sing, but the word should be heaven, not hell. Hopefully that's obvious. And you may not keep track of titles of songs, but we will sing the second one at the close of this lesson. And why would I change the title? That's kind of odd. Caleb mentioned this thought in his devotional or the sermon, one or the other. And I told him that as soon as he said that, I had a thought right away. And he said, well, don't tell people that I said that. So Caleb was quoting other people. I have heard this. I'm sure you have heard this too. And I said to Caleb, do you think that brethren will say this sometimes? And I'm not calling anybody out here. I'm just saying we're evaluating this statement today. You know, Jesus taught more about hell than he did heaven. Let's say that a little bit differently so that it resonates more. What if somebody said this to you? Whether it's true or not, I'm just saying think about the psychological impact. If someone said this, your dad always talked about how much he hated work than how much he loved to spend time with you. Do you get that? That's basically the same scenario, but you're weighted to one side more than the other. The father hates work, but he also loves to spend time with you, supposedly. But you can tell the way that he thinks because he talks about hating work all the time. Now, what if somebody said that to you? A family member said, your dad always talked about how much he hated work rather than how much he loved to spend time with you. How would that make you feel if someone said that to you? What if they said your mother always talked about how much she hated your dad rather than how much she loved you? Let's just say this is the same family situation. Your dad's always talking about how much he hates work rather than how much he would rather spend time with you. And your mother talked about how much she always hated your dad because he always said how much he hated work rather than she talked about, in a positive sense, how much she loved you. To me, that's similar. For someone to say Jesus taught more about hell than he did heaven, how would that affect how you think when you study? What you think about your Savior and what you think about Christianity. And I'm asking this. For a person who would perpetrate this idea that Jesus taught more about hell than he did heaven, if a person were to say that, let's say you're in a discussion with them and you're trying to discuss the positive aspects of Christianity, or the idea that you are confident you're going to heaven, and somebody would retort back to you, you know, Jesus talked more about hell than he did heaven, so you better be careful. And I would wonder, who does that person think they're talking to? Is that like a self-centered idea? You say, well, I don't get how that would be self-centered. If a person would say that, how would the person saying that be excluded from the same idea? They would be just as culpable. When a person says, you know, Jesus taught more about hell than he did heaven, well, that would apply just as much to you, to me, if that's the case. If a person says that, do you think that that would apply to everyone but you? Why would you think you would be excluded? And so you would wonder, what would be the driving mentality for someone to basically perpetrate this idea as if it's something they should be proud of, to hold that particular ideology? Jesus taught more about hell than he did heaven. What do consistently negative weighted thoughts do to you? I'm building a base here. Just bear with me. This would be, let's just classify this. This is a negative approach to two topics. What do you think consistently negative weighted thoughts do to a person's psyche? And those of us who are recovering pessimists, as some people say, understand what that means. Proverbs 23:6. Eat thou not the bread of him that has an evil eye. Everything he sees, he's looking for something evil in it. Now, that may not be the same as what we're discussing here, but we're talking about the perpetuated types of thoughts, perpetual types of thoughts that we build in our psyche that affect how we approach life and how we behave. Eat thou not the bread of him that has an evil eye. All this guy thinks about is evil stuff. Neither desire thou his dainty meats. For as he thinks in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, says he to thee, but his heart is not with thee. Because all he does is think about evil stuff. Now, what do you think about a person who says, Jesus taught more about hell than he did heaven? How would they treat you and other people? Proverbs 10:23. It is as sport to a fool to do mischief. Now, I recognize these passages don't necessarily apply, but I'm saying the principle is people that behave a certain way, that's just what they do. That's what their life is structured around. It is as sport to a fool to do mischief. He's used to practicing whatever the thing is, and it's nothing to him. He thinks it's funny. Deceit is in the heart of them that imagine evil, but the counselors of peace is joy. Let's say this yet another different way. All Jesus talks about is how bad we are and how easy it is for us to go to hell. And we know from lengthy discussions that we've had here that people think that all the time. Saved, how do you say it, Caleb? Saved on Sunday, going to hell on Monday, something like that? That's basically just a different permutation of the same thing. Now, here's the simple approach. And I'm telling you, I have heard people say this, and when Caleb said that, again, he's not saying that, he's quoting someone else saying that. When he said that, I just thought, wait just a minute now. And I asked permission to tell the story, and I'm leaving the person anonymous. The idea that a person tells you something, you take it on face value, and then someone else comes along and tells you something different, and not only that, the person that tells you something different has a badge. Now, who are you going to listen to? And it is possible that the person with a badge can be wrong. They are executors of the law, but sometimes they aren't good students of the law. I'm not saying they're dumb. I'm just saying everybody's human. Lawyers study the law every day. They have to defend or exonerate people based on that. And people who carry a badge don't necessarily read the law every day. Now, what if a person told you that if you bought a new vehicle, you didn't have to have an inspection sticker? And so you said, well, they sell cars every day. They must know what they're talking about. And then you start driving it around, and then a police officer pulls you over and says, hey, what you doing without an inspection sticker? And you say, I was told when I bought the car I didn't have to have one. Well, you got to have one. What's the easy way to settle that? Go back and look at the source. Jesus taught more about hell than he did heaven. The simple approach is to say, wait just a minute now. Is that even true? Now, we're not diminishing the fact that eternal punishment is a thing. But is this even true, and how does that affect your psyche? Somebody says, wait a minute, Luke 16. We just read Luke 16, and that's a real account. It mentions Abraham, so it has to be real. Otherwise, if you go back to John 8, when Jesus says the truth will make you free, Abraham is mentioned there as the father of the free. And if Abraham is mentioned, then it has to be the case in John 8 and in Luke 16. These are real stories. Someone would say, if we were to say back to them, is that even true? They would say, wait a minute, Luke 16, Jesus taught more about hell than he did heaven. Luke 16:22, and it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried, and in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments, and sees Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. So somebody may say, well, you can't dismiss the fact that Jesus talked about hell. Here is a literal account of it. And this was a rich man. He died, was buried, and we say he went to torment. Wait a minute, though. Here is Luke 19, another rich man. And Jesus entered and passed through Jericho, and behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, which was the chief among the publicans, and he was rich. And he sought to see Jesus, who he was, and could not for the press, because he was of little stature. And he ran before and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him, and said unto him, Zacchaeus, make haste, come down, for today I must abide at thy house. And he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all murmured, saying that he was gone to be a guest with a man that is a sinner. Now, let's just layer over top of that this idea. Well, you know, Jesus taught more about hell than he did heaven, and you remember what he said in Luke 16. Well, how about Luke 19? They all murmured, saying that he was gone to be guest with a man that is a sinner. Would these people be saying this if they were our brethren today? Doesn't Jesus know Zacchaeus is going to hell? He's a rich man and a publican. What is Jesus doing? He's teaching these individuals don't belong with him. Why would he visit him? At dinner, nonetheless. And also, doesn't Zacchaeus know how much Jesus talked about hell? Why would Zacchaeus care anything about visiting Jesus when he's a publican, knowing how much supposedly Jesus talked about hell more than heaven? And Zacchaeus stood and said unto the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I restore him fourfold. Now, just this is a side note. People read that, and you may have a tendency to think, well, Zacchaeus was extorting individuals. It could be possible that other individuals are trying to get their neighbors in trouble and telling Zacchaeus, you know, this person hasn't paid their taxes, and Zacchaeus goes and extracts more from them than he should, and then he finds out later maybe it was a lie, and through no fault of Zacchaeus, he says, I'm going to restore fourfold to them because they had no idea this was happening. That's possibly how good of a character as a publican Zacchaeus had. Now, that was a side note. And Jesus said to him, This day is salvation come to this house, for so much as he also is a son of Abraham. And you know he's not talking about his Jewish lineage because he undid that in John 8. So Zacchaeus is a son of faith. And Jesus is saying to faithful individuals, this day is salvation come. For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost. Matthew 23:37. Even when it was at its worst, what was Jesus' mentality? O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that kills the prophets, and he's about to be one of them, and stones them which are sent unto thee. How often? You know, Jesus taught more about hell than he did heaven. How often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you wouldn't? So the problem is not with Jesus in this instance. John 14:2. In my Father's house are many mansions, and he just as Caleb did in a lesson several months ago. Peter is scared to death, and he says, "Don't be troubled. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I would not have withheld this information from you if it weren't the case." And what's he going to do with it? "I'm going to prepare a place for you." What does that mean? He's expecting you to be there. "And if I go to prepare a place for you, I'm going to send you to hell instead. I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." No question in his mind. To a man that he said, "Get behind me, Satan." To other men that constantly wrangled with themselves about who would be the greatest in heaven, to the degree that he has to put a child in the middle of them and say, "You need to behave like this." And he says, "Nevertheless, I'm coming back to receive you to myself." Now, let's do some Bible math. And math is not America's strong suit, but this will be easy. Matthew through John, right? Jesus is alive and he's teaching. So this encompasses the parenthetical timeline of his ministry. What's the score? How many times is the word hell mentioned? Somebody says, "Oh, we're playing this game again." People play this game all the time when we're talking about baptism, words like baptism and repentance and faith and one and the church and the body. People do this all the time. How many times is the word hell mentioned in the gospel accounts? Now, don't answer out loud. I'm just saying, you think to yourself, take a guess. Must be bunches of them. Loads of them, as Caleb would say, right? Got to be in there tons of times. 15 times. So, well, that's a decent amount. No, I'm saying that's across 4 Gospels where you're going to have the same story in Matthew and Mark, and maybe bits and pieces in Luke and John, mentioned multiple times. So really, you could say, possibly, you could argue you cut that in half, 7 times, maybe. We'll go with 15. Now, take a wild guess. How many times do you think the word heaven is mentioned? 130. Now, I know what people are going to say. We'll get to that in just a minute. But I'm saying, on the surface alone, just by word count, the word hell is 11% of the word heaven. Said another way, heaven is mentioned 10 times more than hell. Now, on that stat alone, if you can remember that, and a person were to say to you, you know, Jesus taught more about hell. Nope, that's wrong. 15 times hell, 130 times heaven. Even if you said 10 times more, 15 and 150, you're not far off base. 15 times hell, 130 heaven. Does that make an impression on you? At least to some degree? Does that help to offset the idea? Now, somebody says, well, that's just word count. That doesn't mean anything. Well, any other time, word count would mean something. But I'll give a little bit of leeway to that. Because it's possible that Jesus could be discussing hell, but not necessarily in a negative sense. And it's also possible Jesus could be discussing heaven, but not necessarily in a positive sense. That is true. Now, here's a sample of the word hell. We'll go through these briefly. Matthew 5:22, "Thou fool shall be in danger of hellfire." Matthew 5:29, "And not that thy whole body shall be cast into hell." Matthew 5:30, not that thy whole body shall be cast into hell. Matthew 10:28, "Which is able to destroy both body and soul in hell." Matthew 11:23, "Capernaum, which art exalted unto heaven, shall be brought down to hell." Matthew 16:18, "The gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Matthew 18:9, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire. Matthew 23:15. You make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Matthew 23:33. You serpents, you generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell? Now, that is literally, well, not literally, it'd be one less than half because we're working with 15, but I'm saying you get my point. That's half of the verses on hell in one slide. And we could fit the other half in another. And you could say you could cut that in half because if you flip over to Mark, you're going to have some of the same stuff mentioned again. Now, here is a sample of the word heaven. Matthew 4:17, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. 5:3, blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. 5:10, the kingdom of heaven. 5:12, our Father which are your Father which is in heaven. 5:19, the kingdom of heaven. 5:20, the kingdom of heaven. And you'll notice I've got 5:20 highlighted. We'll get back to that in a second. 7:11, your Father which is in heaven. 7:21, the kingdom of heaven. Father which is in heaven. 8:11, the kingdom of heaven. 10:7, the kingdom of heaven. 10:32, your Father which is in heaven. 10:33, your Father which is in heaven. Matthew 11:11, the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Matthew 11:12, the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 11:23, exalted unto heaven. Matthew 11:25, O Father, Lord of heaven. 12:50, Father which is in heaven. 13:11, the kingdom of heaven. 13:24, the kingdom of heaven. 13:31, the kingdom of heaven. And I'm saying I forgot to count that. I think we'll get to that in just a second. That's like literally a sliver of the verses that constitute heaven. And if you notice the ones that I've got highlighted, there are only 4. What does that mean? Just like pretty much with anything else, there are probably 3 categories of any particular subject. Maybe 2, it depends. There's an informational category where you're just discussing facts. It's not weighted one way or the other. Matthew 11:25, for example. At that time, Jesus answered and said, I thank thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth. What do you get from that? You get the fact that the Father is Lord of heaven and of earth. Not positive, not negative, mainly. You have a positive category of this particular topic. Matthew 5:23, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's positive in nature. And then you can have negative. Matthew 10:33. But whosoever shall deny me before men, him will I also deny before my Father which is in heaven. Now, the sample that we looked at for the word heaven constituted 21 verses, which basically makes up only 16% of the total heaven talk. Now, when you start discussing counting totals and percentages, people tend to fall asleep, but I promise this won't be very long, right? 21 verses that we just looked at on heaven in the sample, and that's only 16% of the entire total of the word heaven. 4 of the 21 that we looked at were negative in nature. That's only 20% of the sample. Now, if you were to take out 20% of the 130 verses, or the 130 times that the word heaven is mentioned, you still have 104 verses about heaven versus 15 about hell. And let's just say you jack that up to 30%. 1 in every 3 verses would be negative about heaven. Whatever the math comes to on that, that's going to be probably about 100 you'd still have about 95 verses roughly left about heaven versus 15 on hell. That has to make a mental impact on us. Is this making sense at all? I know this is super simple, but I'm saying for people to perpetuate the idea that Jesus talked more about hell than he did heaven, I'm not saying that he didn't discuss the eternal nature of it, the punishment aspect of it, the fact that you don't want to go there, the just nature of it, that people who just refuse to treat their fellow man with respect and honor and treat God with respect and honor have a place there for them. The angels who caused problems have a place there for them. I'm not denying that, but I'm saying for people to perpetuate an idea that would possibly affect our psyche in a negative sense, I just can't find that on the surface. Jesus taught more about hell than he did heaven. This is our last slide. What's the verdict? I'm saying you decide for yourself, but after what I looked at, I'm basically convinced that is a false idea, and it doesn't do us any good. It's not healthy for us. I would feel embarrassed if I were telling people at their doorstep this idea. If we're trying to convince them that Christianity is worth the effort, it's good for us, it will reshape our life, it will reshape our community, it will reshape the country and the world, and we're telling people this when it's most likely not even true, that kind of negates the progress that we're trying to make. And so I'm saying today, this morning, my verdict is that's a false idea, and I'm not going to perpetuate that. Let's all sing.